Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. The snowstorm rolled in faster than the weather reports had warned. Daniel squinted into the wall of white from behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, its heater struggling against the creeping cold. The logging road he followed was narrow and treacherous, with steep drop-offs on either side. He cursed under his breath. This was supposed to be a quick supply run to town, but the storm had other plans. As the truck's tires slid on the icy road, Daniel considered turning back. That was when he saw it, just a fleeting glimpse in his headlights. A figure stumbling through the snow, barely visible. His foot hit the brakes, and the truck skidded before coming to a stop. The figure didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting. Daniel grabbed his coat and flashlight, reluctantly stepping into the biting wind. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. The figure turned toward him, a man, pale and shivering, his clothes tattered and unsuited for the weather. His lips were blue and his hands were bare. I I got lost," the man stammered, his voice thin and brittle, like cracking ice. Daniel hesitated. Something about the man set his nerves on edge, but he couldn't leave him out here to freeze. "Come on, get in the truck. We'll get you warmed up." The man nodded but didn't move. Daniel had to guide him by the arm, and his skin was icy to the touch, almost inhumanly cold. Back in the truck, the heater barely made a dent in the frigid air that clung to the stranger. He sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, trying to break the uneasy silence. The man hesitated as though he hadn't been asked in a long time. "Eli." "Where were you headed, Eli?" "Anywhere but here," Eli replied, his voice carrying a strange weight. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. Something about those words made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The drive to the cabin felt endless, the storm growing fiercer with every mile. Daniel kept stealing glances at Eli, who hadn't stopped shivering despite the heater blasting directly on him. When they finally reached the cabin, Daniel ushered Eli inside. The man's movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if he wasn't used to walking. Daniel lit a fire in the stone fireplace and handed Eli a blanket. "You're lucky I found you," Daniel said. "A few more hours out there and you'd be a popsicle." Eli didn't respond. He just stared at the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames in a way that made Daniel's stomach churn. As the hours passed, the storm howled outside, sealing them in a cocoon of snow and ice. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eli hadn't eaten or drunk anything. He barely moved, except to shift his gaze from the fire to the windows, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Around midnight, Daniel woke to a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as he listened closer, he realized it was humming. He crept into the living room, where Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the window. The humming came from him, low and guttural, resonating with the storm outside. "Eli?" Daniel called softly. The humming stopped. Eli turned his head slowly, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. His eyes were no longer human. They were pale, like the color of frost, and they glowed faintly in the dark. Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering. "What the hell are you?" Eli stood, his movements unnaturally smooth. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice colder than the wind outside. The fire flickered and dimmed as the room grew colder. Frost crept up the walls, and Daniel's breath came out in visible puffs. "I'm sorry," Daniel stammered, edging toward the door. Eli smiled, a sharp, unnatural grin that didn't reach his frostbitten eyes. "It doesn't matter now. The cold always takes what it's owed." The windows shattered inward as a blast of icy wind engulfed the. Daniel tried to run, but the cold was everywhere, freezing his limbs, numbing his mind. He collapsed to the floor, his vision fading as frost overtook his body. When he woke, the storm had passed. The cabin was eerily quiet, the fire burned out. Daniel staggered to his feet, his joints aching as if he'd aged decades overnight. Eli was gone. The only sign of his presence was a trail of frost leading to the door, which hung open, letting in the morning light. Daniel stepped outside, his breath catching in his throat. The snow around the cabin was littered with footprints, hundreds of them, circling the house in chaotic patterns. The cold stayed with him, not just in his bones, but in his soul. No matter how many fires he lit or layers he wore, he could never get warm again. And every time the wind howled at night, he swore he could hear Eli's voice humming, calling him back to the snow. It was supposed to be a perfect winter afternoon. Grace and her husband Tom had packed a thermos of hot chocolate and laced up their skates for a day on the frozen lake. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the snow-covered pines surrounding the lake made it look like something out of a holiday postcard. The lake had been frozen solid for weeks, and though the nearest town was miles away, locals swore it was safe. Still, Grace couldn't shake a nagging unease as she stepped onto the ice. It wasn't the creaking or cracking sounds beneath their blades. That was normal for a frozen lake. It was the stillness, the way the air seemed to hold its breath as they skated further from shore. They skated hand in hand, laughing and spinning, their breath misting in the cold. Grace found herself relaxing, even as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ice. That was when she noticed it. A shadow beneath the ice, dark and sinuous, moving just beneath the surface. She stopped abruptly, her skates scraping the ice. Tom, did you see that? See what? Tom skidded to a halt, following her gaze. There was, something under the ice. Tom chuckled, his breath visible in the freezing air. It's probably just cracks or bubbles. Nothing to worry about? Grace nodded hesitantly, though her eyes stayed on the ice. She was about to brush it off as her imagination when she saw it again. This time, there were two shadows, darting beneath her feet like fish in an aquarium. But they were too large, too deliberate in their movements to be anything natural. Tom! She hissed, grabbing his arm. He saw them now, too. His playful grin faded as he bent closer to the ice, squinting. What the hell is that? The shadows moved with purpose, circling the couple. One of them paused directly beneath Grace. She felt a chill climb her spine, colder than the winter air. They're watching us. Tom shook his head. No, that's ridiculous. It's just an illusion. Light reflecting weirdly off the ice, or a loud crack interrupted him. It echoed across the frozen expanse, and both of them froze. Maybe we should head back, Grace said, her voice trembling. Tom nodded. Yeah, good idea. They began skating toward the shore, but the shadows followed, staying just beneath them. Grace glanced back and gasped. There were more of them now, 4, 5, 6, moving in unison like a pack of predators. The ice groaned beneath their feet, and Grace felt it vibrate through her skates. Tom, hurry! They picked up speed, but no matter how fast they skated, the shadows kept pace. Grace risked another look down and nearly stumbled. She could see faces now, faint and distorted, pressed against the underside of the ice. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths stretched open in silent screams. Tom, they're right under us! Tom didn't respond. When she looked at him, she saw his face had gone pale, his gaze fixed ahead. Grace followed his eyes and screamed. The shoreline was gone. The trees that had surrounded the lake had disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of white. It was as if the lake had stretched into infinity, swallowing the world around it. This isn't real, Tom muttered. This can't be real. The shadows below them began to rise, pressing closer to the surface. Grace could see hands now, clawing at the ice, their fingers unnaturally long and skeletal. Run! She shouted, abandoning her skates and slipping across the ice on her boots. Tom followed, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But the shadows moved faster, their movements becoming more frantic, more aggressive. The ice cracked beneath Grace's feet, a thin spiderweb of fissures radiating outward. She screamed as a pale, emaciated hand broke through the ice, clawing at her ankle. Its grip was impossibly strong, the fingers like frozen iron. Tom! Help me! Tom lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling with all his strength. The hand released her, and they both tumbled backward onto the ice. The shadows beneath them were no longer just shadows. They were figures now, fully visible through the fractured ice. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths opening and closing in a soundless wail. One of them looked like a child. Grace froze, her heart plummeting. The figure had the same dark curls and round cheeks as her son, Charlie, the son they had lost 3 years ago in a drowning accident. Charlie, she whispered, crawling toward the ice. Grace, no! Tom shouted, grabbing her arm, but she couldn't look away. The figure stared up at her, its small hand pressing against the ice as if reaching for her. It's him, she sobbed. Tom, it's Charlie. It's not Charlie, Tom yelled, dragging her back. It's not him. The ice groaned loudly, and a massive crack split the surface beneath them. The water surged up, black and frigid, swallowing the figures and everything around them. The last thing Grace saw before the ice gave way completely was the childlike figure mouthing a single word, Mama. When Grace woke, she was lying on the snowy shore, her body trembling violently from the cold. Tom was next to her, coughing and shivering, his face ashen. The lake was still. The ice was unbroken. But Grace knew what she had seen, and when she looked down at her wrist, she found frostbitten fingerprints circling it like a bracelet. Tom never spoke about what happened, but Grace could feel the distance growing between them. He refused to skate, refused to even look at the lake. And every winter, when the ice froze over and the wind howled across the water, Grace swore she could see shadows moving beneath the surface, waiting. The storm had arrived earlier than the forecast predicted. By the time Sarah finished her shift at the small town library, the snow was falling in thick, relentless sheets, and the wind howled through the deserted streets. She pulled her coat tighter around her and hurried to her car, the silence of the world around her unsettling. The drive home was treacherous, her car skidding on the icy roads as the snow piled higher. Her little house sat on the edge of town, isolated and surrounded by a dense forest. Normally, she enjoyed the solitude, but tonight it felt oppressive. As she parked in her driveway, she noticed how the snow seemed to absorb all sound. There was no crunch of her boots as she walked to the front door, no hum of wind chimes she'd hung on the porch. Even the wind itself, though strong enough to bend the trees, was eerily silent. Inside, the house was cold. She quickly lit a fire in the old wood stove and made herself a cup of tea. Sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, she watched the snow pile up outside, her unease growing. The silence was so absolute it felt unnatural, as if the world outside had been smothered. Hours passed, and the storm didn't. The snow was now halfway up her windows, and the sky was an impenetrable white. Sarah tried to distract herself by reading, but the silence pressed down on her, making it impossible to focus. And then she heard it. A faint sound, muffled but distinct. A voice. She froze, her heart pounding. It was distant, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. A voice calling out, faint and plaintive. Help! Sarah stood and went to the window, peering into the storm. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Then she spotted movement, a figure stumbling through the drifts, falling and struggling to rise again. Her breath caught. Someone was out there, lost in the blizzard. Grabbing her coat and a flashlight, she threw open the door and stepped into the icy storm. The cold was brutal, biting through her layers as she called out, "Hello, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond, but continued stumbling toward her. The snow was so thick that she could barely make out its shape, but it looked small, childlike. "Hang on," she shouted, trudging toward them. As she got closer, the figure collapsed, vanishing into the snow. She reached the spot where they had fallen, but there was nothing there, no body, no tracks, just untouched snow. Her flashlight flickered, and the voice came again, closer this time. "Help me!" She spun around, her breath visible in short, frantic puffs. The voice sounded like a child's, a little girl's. "Where are you?" she cried, the panic rising in her chest. The wind whipped around her, carrying the voice with it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Please, don't leave me." The flashlight flickered again and went out, plunging her into darkness. The snow swirled around her like a living thing, blinding and suffocating. She stumbled back toward the house, her heart racing. When she reached the porch, she slammed the door shut behind her and leaned against it, her body trembling. She could still hear the voice, faint and pleading, outside the door. She locked the door and bolted it, her breath shallow and rapid. The fire in the stove had nearly gone out, leaving the room in shadow. She hurried to relight it, her hands shaking so badly that she dropped the matches twice. As the flames roared back to life, she felt a momentary sense of relief. But then, she heard it again. The voice wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the house. "Help me!" Sarah turned slowly, her blood running cold. The voice was coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. She grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, her hands slick with sweat despite the freezing air. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The hallway was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable. The voice came again, closer now, echoing softly. "Please, I'm so cold." She crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under her feet. The voice led her to the spare bedroom, a room she hadn't used in years. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. She pushed the door open with the poker, her breath hitching. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the footprints, small, barefoot prints in the snow, leading from the window to the bed. The bed was unmade, the blankets pulled back as if someone had climbed into it. The voice came again, soft and plaintive. "Help me." Sarah backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. She ran back to the living room, her mind racing. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone in the house. The fire in the wood stove flared suddenly, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The shadows moved unnaturally, writhing and twisting like living things. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, where the firelight barely reached, stood the figure of a little girl. Her hair hung in wet, frozen strands over her pale face, and her eyes were wide and dark, pools of endless cold. "Please," the girl whispered. "I'm so cold." Sarah screamed, stumbling backward. The girl took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Frost spread in her wake, crawling up the walls and across the floor. "Stay away!" Sarah shouted, swinging the poker wildly. The girl didn't stop. Her voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing in Sarah's ears until it was all she could hear. And then, the fire went out. When Sarah's neighbors finally dug her house out of the snow days later, they found her sitting in the armchair by the window, staring out at the frozen forest. Her body was frozen solid, a thin layer of frost covering her skin. The window beside her was open, though there was no sign of anyone having entered or left. But in the snow outside, they found a trail of small, barefoot prints leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. The night was bitterly cold, colder than any Daryl could remember in his 50 years, living in the remote mountains of Vermont. The blizzard had started at dusk, and by midnight, the snow was already waist deep. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows of his small cabin, and he could feel the icy drafts sneaking in through every crack. Daryl was used to solitude. After his wife had passed years ago, he had embraced the quiet life, chopping wood and keeping his old generator running during the brutal winters. Tonight he was curled up by the fireplace, sipping whiskey and reading a worn paperback. The storm, a constant background roar. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. Daryl froze, his heart pounding. No one ever came to his cabin, not in weather like this. The knock came again, louder this time. Setting his whiskey aside, he grabbed the rifle he kept by the fireplace and moved cautiously toward the door. "Who's there?" he called, his voice gruff. No answer. He unlatched the door and opened it a crack, the icy wind immediately cutting through him. A figure stood on his porch, hunched against the cold. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, wrapped in a tattered coat and scarf, his face mostly obscured. Snow clung to his clothes and hair, and his gloved hands were pressed together as if in prayer. "Please," and the man said, his voice hoarse. "Let me in." The storm. Daryl hesitated. Something about the man set his teeth on edge, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Still, he couldn't leave someone to freeze to death. He opened the door wider, motioning the man inside. "Come on, then, but leave your boots by the door." The man shuffled in, snow falling from his coat and pooling on the wooden floor. He stood awkwardly near the door, his head bowed, as if unsure of his welcome. "Take off your coat and warm up by the fire," Daryl said, trying to keep the unease out of his voice. The man didn't respond right away. Slowly, he unwrapped the scarf from his neck, revealing a pale, gaunt face. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. "Thank you," the man said, his lips barely moving. Daryl nodded, watching as the stranger moved to the fireplace and crouched by the flames. His movements were stiff and unnatural, like someone unfamiliar with their own body. "Where'd you come from?" Daryl asked, leaning his rifle against the wall but keeping it within reach. "Nowhere nearby," the man replied, his voice quiet. "I've been walking a long time." Daryl frowned. "Walking? In this storm?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he held his hands out to the fire. Daryl noticed something strange then. Steam rose from his gloves as if they were wet, but the snow on his coat hadn't melted. The unease grew stronger. "You hungry?" Daryl asked, more to break the silence than anything else. The man looked up, his dark eyes meeting Daryl's. "No," he said. Daryl felt a chill unrelated to the weather. He cleared his throat and turned toward the kitchen. "Suit yourself. I'm heating some soup for myself." As he moved away, he could feel the man's gaze on his back, heavy and unrelenting. In the kitchen, he tried to collect his thoughts. Something was off. The man's clothes were ragged, but he didn't look frostbitten, and his breath wasn't visible in the cold air. Daryl's instincts, honed from years of living alone, were screaming at him that this stranger didn't belong. When he returned to the living room, bowl of soup in hand, the man was standing by the fireplace, staring at the wall. "Something wrong?" Daryl asked, keeping his tone casual. The man turned slowly, his movements jerky, like a marionette. "You've been here a long time," he said, his voice distant. Daryl frowned. "Yeah? What of it?" "It's quiet here," the man continued, as if he hadn't heard. "Too quiet. It lets them in." Daryl's grip on the bowl tightened. "What are you talking about?" The man tilted his head, a strange, almost childlike gesture. "The ones in the storm. They follow. They watch. They wait." Daryl felt his stomach drop. "You're not making any sense. Who's they?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer to the window, peering out into the blizzard. "They're here." Daryl set the bowl down, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's here?" The man turned back to him, his expression blank. "They've found me, and now they'll find you." At that moment, the wind outside shifted, no longer a howl, but a low, mournful wail, like the sound of countless voices crying out in unison. The lights flickered, and the fire in the hearth dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Daryl grabbed his rifle. I think it's time for you to leave. The man didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the window, his expression one of quiet resignation. It's too late, he whispered. The lights went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. The wailing grew louder, closer, and Darrell could feel the cold seeping into the room, far colder than the storm outside. He turned toward the door, intending to throw it open and force the man out, but froze. Through the frosted glass of the window, he could see them. Figures tall and thin, their forms barely more than silhouettes, stood just beyond the porch. Their limbs were impossibly long, their movements slow and deliberate as they pressed against the glass. The man stepped back from the window, his face pale but calm. They've come for me, he said. But they'll take you too? Darrell didn't wait to hear more. He fired the rifle at the window, shattering the glass. The sound was deafening, but the figures didn't flinch. Instead, they stepped inside, moving through the jagged frame as if the broken glass wasn't there. The last thing Darrell saw before the cold overtook him was the man's face, his lips forming the faintest of smiles as he whispered, "It's better this way." When the storm cleared the next day, search parties found Darrell's cabin buried in snow. The windows were shattered, the door hanging open, but there was no sign of him or anyone else. Inside, the fire had burned out, and frost coated every surface. The only clue was a set of footprints leading from the cabin into the woods, where they vanished without a trace. Maya had never liked winters in the little town of Black Hollow. The long, dark nights, the constant snowstorms, and the eerie quiet of the surrounding woods made her uneasy. But this year felt different. The winter was harsher, colder, and the nights seemed to stretch longer than they should. She had moved to Black Hollow 6 months ago, taking a job as a caretaker for an elderly woman named Mrs. Winters. The old woman lived alone in a sprawling Victorian house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest. The house was drafty and filled with shadows that seemed to shift when Maya wasn't looking. It was during one of the worst snowstorms of the season that Maya first noticed something was wrong. She was sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, sipping tea and reading a book, while Mrs. Winters slept upstairs. The wind howled outside, and the snow lashed against the windows like icy claws. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible over the storm. Maya frowned and set her book down, straining to listen. Another knock, louder this time. Her pulse quickened. No one ever visited the house, especially not in weather like. She grabbed a flashlight and walked cautiously to the front door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She opened the door a crack, the cold immediately biting at her skin. The porch was empty. Snow had piled up against the door, untouched by footprints. As she closed the door, a sound behind her made her freeze. A faint shuffling noise, like someone moving through the house. "Mrs. Winters?" she called, her voice echoing down the hallway. No response. Maya walked toward the stairs, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. At the top, the door to Mrs. Winters' room was ajar, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze. "Mrs. Winters?" Maya pushed the door open. The old woman was lying in bed, her frail body barely a lump under the heavy blankets. Her face was turned toward the window, her eyes wide open and glassy. "Mrs. Winters?" Maya stepped closer, dread curling in her stomach. The old woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Maya leaned in, her heart hammering. "Shadows," Mrs. Winters whispered, her voice so faint it was barely audible. "They come with the cold." A sudden thud downstairs made Maya jump. She turned toward the door, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "I'll be right back," she said, though Mrs. Winters didn't seem to hear her. The sound had come from the living room. As she descended the stairs, the air grew colder, each breath visible in front of her. The house was eerily quiet, save for the wind howling outside. She found the living room empty, but the large bay window was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. Maya slammed the window shut, her hands trembling. She locked it and turned to leave, but stopped when she saw the footprints in the snow. They were small, like a child's, and they led from the window to the center of the room, but there was nothing there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker now, deeper. Maya's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement, a faint, slithering motion, as if the darkness itself was alive. She backed out of the room, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. As she turned to head back upstairs, she heard a voice. "Maya." It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it came from the hallway. She spun around, shining her flashlight. The beam illuminated the empty hallway, but the voice came closer. "Maya." She bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding. When she reached Mrs. Winter's room, the old woman was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," Mrs. Winters rasped. "Who?" Maya asked, her voice shaking. "The shadows," the old woman whispered. "They've come for me." Before Maya could respond, the room grew unnaturally cold. The shadows in the corners stretched and twisted, creeping up the walls and across the ceiling. "Maya," the voice called again, this time from inside the room. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Maya fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the room, but the shadows continued to move, growing closer. Mrs. Winters let out a strangled cry, her frail body convulsing. "Don't let them take me!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the small room. Maya grabbed the old woman's hand, trying to pull her out of bed. But the shadows were everywhere now, closing in like a living thing. "Maya!" The voice was right behind her. She turned, and for a brief moment, she saw it. A figure made entirely of darkness, its hollow eyes staring into hers. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. The figure lunged at her, and the flashlight shattered as it hit the floor. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun shone weakly through the clouds. A neighbor, concerned that Mrs. Winters hadn't answered her phone, came to check on the house. He found the front door ajar, the house silent. In Mrs. Winters' room, the bed was empty, the sheets rumpled and covered in frost. And in the living room, he found two sets of footprints, one adult-sized, the other small, like a child's, leading to the bay window, which was wide open. The small village of Frosthaven sat on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense pine forests and towering mountains. Winters there were harsh, with snowdrifts burying homes and the sun barely gracing the sky. But the villagers knew how to survive, and they prided themselves on their resilience. Every winter, the lake froze over, its surface becoming a thick sheet of glistening ice. It was a playground for children, a fishing ground for the locals, and a meeting place for the hardy souls who called Frosthaven home. This year, however, the ice felt different. It was darker, almost opaque, and no matter how thick it appeared, strange cracks would appear overnight, spidering out like veins. The elders warned everyone to stay away, claiming the ice wasn't safe. But Will didn't listen. Will was a teenager, brimming with youthful defiance and an eagerness to prove himself. He hated the village, its isolation, and its endless rules. The warnings about the lake only fueled his curiosity. One moonless night, while the village was asleep, Will bundled up in his warmest clothes, grabbed his skates, and made his way to the lake. The air was biting, the wind carrying whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The lake stretched out before him, its surface shimmering faintly under the pale starlight. He strapped on his skates, ignoring the unease creeping up his spine, and stepped onto the ice. The first few glides were exhilarating. The cold air rushed past his face, and the world felt silent and still, save for the soft scrape of his blades. But as he ventured further from the shore, the ice beneath him seemed to hum. A low, almost imperceptible vibration traveled through his feet, growing stronger with each step. He stopped, panting, and looked around. The village lights were distant, barely visible through the trees. He was alone in the middle of the frozen expanse. And then he saw it. Beneath the ice, something moved. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon. But as he crouched down, squinting at the surface, he realized it was no shadow. A pale, humanoid figure swam beneath the ice, its limbs elongated and twisting unnaturally. Its face was featureless, save for two dark, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. Will stumbled back, his heart racing. The figure stopped moving as if sensing him. Slowly it turned its head upward, its eyeless gaze locking onto his. He scrambled to his feet and began skating back toward the shore, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The ice beneath him groaned and creaked, the cracks spreading faster than his skates could carry him. A sudden, deafening noise, like the roar of thunder, echoed across the lake. Will glanced over his shoulder and saw the figure beneath the ice moving again, faster this time, its long limbs propelling it toward him. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning with effort, but the creature was gaining on him. The cracks in the ice widened, and he could feel the surface trembling beneath his weight. Just as he reached the edge of the lake, the ice gave way. Will fell, his body plunging into the freezing water. The shock of the cold stole his breath, and the darkness closed in around him. He flailed, his hands clawing at the jagged edges of the ice. Above him, the pale figure hovered, its hands pressing against the underside of the ice, as if mocking him. With a final burst of strength, Will pulled himself out of the water and onto the snowy shore. He lay there, shivering and gasping, as the creature retreated into the depths, its dark eyes never leaving his. When he finally stumbled back into the village, soaked and half frozen, he tried to tell the others what had happened. But no one believed him. They called him reckless, a troublemaker, and dismissed his story as the ramblings of a scared boy. The next day, the villagers found the lake eerily still. The cracks had vanished, and the ice seemed thicker than ever. But beneath its surface, the shadows remained. And on quiet nights, when the wind died down and the world held its breath, the villagers swore they could hear something moving beneath the ice. Riley hated driving in snowstorms, but she had no choice. Her sister's cabin was deep in the wilderness, and with their mother sick, Riley needed to deliver supplies. The storm had started early that afternoon, a thick, relentless flurry that turned the winding mountain roads into a treacherous maze. By nightfall, visibility was nearly zero. The only light came from her car's headlights, which illuminated the swirling snow like ghostly tendrils. The radio crackled with static, and her GPS had lost signal hours ago. Just a little further, Riley muttered to herself, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen, relieved to see a text from her sister. "Where are you? Be careful. Something's wrong out." Riley's stomach tightened. She typed a quick reply at the next stop sign. "Almost there. What do you mean?" Her sister's response came almost immediately. "Don't stop for anything." Riley frowned, her pulse quickening. The message was cryptic, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She needed to focus on the road. The storm intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. Snow piled up against her windshield wipers, and the trees lining the road loomed like skeletal sentinels. As she rounded a bend, her headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Riley slammed on the brakes, her tires skidding on the icy surface. The car came to a halt just feet from the figure. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat and scarf, his face obscured by the falling snow. He stood motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides. Riley rolled down her window a crack. "Hey, are you okay?" she called, her voice barely audible over the wind. The man didn't respond. A chill crept up her spine. Something about him felt wrong, unnatural. She glanced at her phone, remembering her sister's warning. "Don't stop for anything." The man took a step toward her car. Panic set in. Riley rolled up the window and shifted into reverse, her heart pounding. The man continued to approach, his movements slow and deliberate. As she backed away, her headlights illuminated something horrifying. There were more figures emerging from the trees on either side of the road. They moved in unison, their heads tilted at odd angles, their eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. Riley hit the gas, swerving back onto the road and speeding past them. Her car fishtailed, but she managed to regain control. She didn't dare look back. The road stretched on endlessly, the storm growing worse with every mile. Riley's hands ached from gripping the wheel, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. She reached a fork in the road, the signs obscured by snow. "Which way?" she whispered, glancing between the two paths. Her phone buzzed again. She picked it up with shaking hands and read the message. "Take the left. Hurry." Riley didn't question it. She turned left, the tires crunching over the thick snow. The road narrowed, the trees closing in around her. Her relief was short-lived. In her rearview mirror, she saw them, the figures, moving through the storm, their outlines blurred but unmistakable. They were following her. Riley floored the accelerator, her car bouncing over the uneven road. The figures kept pace, their movements impossibly fast despite the snow. Suddenly, her car lurched to a stop, the engine sputtering. "No, no, no!" she cried, slamming her fist against the steering wheel. The fuel gauge needle sat firmly on empty. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed her sister's number. Pick up," she whispered, her eyes darting to the figures, now just yards away. The call connected and her sister's voice came through, shaky and urgent. "Riley, are you still in the car?" "Yes," Riley gasped. "They're here." "Listen to me," sister said. "Don't get out. Lock the doors and don't look at them. No matter what you hear, don't open the door." Riley locked the doors, her hands trembling. The figures surrounded the car, their faces obscured by the storm. They pressed their hands against the windows, their nails dragging across the glass, with a sound that made her skin crawl. The wind howled louder, carrying voices, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Riley," she froze. The voice was her mother's. "Riley, it's me. Let me in." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "You're not real," she whispered. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The figures outside the car pressed closer, their faces mere inches from the glass. Their eyes were empty sockets, black and endless. The storm raged on, the voices blending into a cacophony of sound. Riley curled into the driver's seat, covering her ears and squeezing her eyes shut. Hours passed. The whispers faded, and the storm began to subside. When Riley finally opened her eyes, the figures were gone. The road was empty, and the first light of dawn broke through the trees. She stumbled out of the car, her legs weak and unsteady. In the distance, she saw her sister's cabin, its windows glowing warmly. But as she approached, a sense of unease washed over her. The cabin was eerily quiet, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the living room was empty, the fireplace cold and unlit. On the table, her sister's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Riley's own number. "Where are you? Be careful. Something's wrong out here." Elliot had always loved the wilderness. The isolation, the quiet, and the beauty of the untouched nature were what drew him to his remote cabin every winter. This year was no different, except for the weather. The storms had come earlier than usual, ferocious and unrelenting, blanketing the forest in snow and ice. He had been snowed in for 3 days when he noticed the footprints. They appeared just beyond his porch, leading from the tree line to his cabin. Single-file tracks, too small to belong to an adult, but too defined to be from an animal. They stopped abruptly a few feet from his door, as though their maker had vanished into thin air. Elliot stared at the tracks for a long time, his breath visible in the freezing air. He lived miles from the nearest neighbor, and the idea of a child wandering alone in this weather seemed impossible. By evening, the storm had picked up again. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows and piling snow higher against the walls. Elliot lit the fireplace and settled into his chair with a book, trying to shake the unease that lingered from earlier. But the sound came in, a faint tapping. Elliot froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The cabin had no neighbors, no visitors. Slowly, he turned his head toward the noise. Nothing was there. He exhaled and shook his head, chalking it up to the wind. But as he returned to his book, the tapping came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, he rose from his chair and approached the window. The storm obscured his view, but he could just make out a figure standing at the edge of the porch. "Hello," he called, his voice muffled by the storm. The figure didn't move. It was small, no taller than a child, and its outline seemed to shimmer in the snow. Elliot grabbed his coat and flashlight, stepping out onto the porch. The cold bit into his skin as he aimed the beam toward the figure, but there was no one there. The footprints were back, leading from the tree line to the porch. They stopped right where the figure had been standing. "Hello?" Elliot called again, his voice shaking. The forest remained silent, the wind carrying only the sound of snow falling heavily around him. He retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind him and stoking the fire higher. The tapping didn't return, but that night, Elliot dreamed of children's laughter, soft and echoing, as though coming from deep within the woods. The next morning, he woke to find more footprints. This time, they circled the cabin. Elliot stood at the window, staring out at the eerie pattern. The tracks were small, childlike, but there was something unnatural about them. The spacing was too precise, the placement too deliberate. As he stood there, trying to make sense of it, he heard a faint giggle. It came from inside the cabin. Elliot spun around, his heart pounding. The room was empty, save for the crackling fire and the faint creak of the old wooden floor. "Who's there?" he demanded, grabbing the poker from the fireplace. The cabin remained silent. That night, the laughter returned, louder and closer. Elliot sat by the fire, gripping the poker tightly, as shadows danced on the walls. Around midnight, the tapping began again. Not at the window this time, but at the door. Elliot approached cautiously, his breath hitching. Through the frosted glass pane, he could see them. 3 small figures, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their faces obscured by the snow. "Go away!" he shouted, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, a child's voice, faint and melodic. "Come play with us, Elliot." He backed away from the door, clutching the poker. The figures didn't move, but their voices grew louder, echoing through the cabin. "Come play with us." The fireplace flickered, the flames dimming until the room was cast in shadows. The laughter returned, filling the space around him. Elliot bolted for the back door, flinging it open and stumbling into the snow. The storm had subsided, leaving the forest eerily quiet. He didn't look back. He ran, his boots crunching through the snow, as he headed toward the nearest town, miles away. When he finally reached safety, frostbitten and delirious, he told the locals what had happened. The old man at the tavern shook his head, his expression grim. "You've seen the frostbitten one," he said. "They're the spirits of children lost to the winter. They don't want to hurt you. They just want company." Elliot never returned to his cabin, but sometimes, on quiet winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind carries faint whispers, he swears he can still hear them. "Come play with us." Erin had never been one for extravagant vacations, but when her friend Marissa insisted on a weekend getaway to a luxurious mountain lodge, she reluctantly agreed. "It'll be fun," Marissa had said. "Just us, a cozy fire, and all the hot cocoa we can drink." The lodge was tucked away deep in the Rockies, accessible only by a winding road that disappeared into the snow-covered wilderness. By the time they arrived, dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray. The lodge itself was massive, a towering wooden structure with high slanted roofs and wide glass windows that reflected the snowy expanse around it. Inside, the warmth of a roaring fire greeted them. A friendly receptionist handed them a key to their room, but Erin couldn't help noticing how empty the place felt. The grand hall echoed their footsteps, and the few other guests they saw avoided eye contact, their faces pale and drawn. Their room was on the third floor, overlooking the dense forest that surrounded the lodge. As Marissa unpacked, Erin wandered to the window. The trees seemed unnaturally still, as if frozen in time. That night, after dinner in the eerily quiet dining hall, the two women retired to their room. Erin couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. There was something off about the lodge, something she couldn't quite name. Around midnight, she woke to a faint sound, a soft humming, almost melodic, coming from the hallway. "Marissa," she whispered, shaking her friend awake. Marissa groaned. "What? Do you hear that?" Marissa listened, then shrugged. "Probably someone walking around. Go back to sleep." But Erin couldn't. The humming continued, growing louder and more distinct. Against her better judgment, she slipped out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by flickering wall sconces. The humming seemed to come from the far end, near the stairs. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The humming stopped. A cold draft swept through the hallway, making her shiver. She stepped back into the room and locked the door, her heart racing. The next morning, Erin told Marissa about the strange noise, but her friend dismissed it. "You're just not used to places like this," she said, laughing. "It's probably your imagination." But Erin wasn't convinced. That evening, they decided to explore the lodge. They wandered through the common areas, discovering old photographs lining the walls, black and white images of guests from decades past. Erin paused in front of one photo, her brow furrowing. The photo showed a group of people standing outside the lodge, bundled in heavy coats, but their expressions were unsettling. Each face was blank, devoid of any emotion, their eyes staring directly at the camera. A plaque beneath the photo read, "Winter, 1923, The Lost Weekend." Erin felt a chill run down her spine. Later that night, as they sat by the fire in the lounge, an older man approached them. His face was weathered, his eyes dark and tired. "You should leave," he said quietly, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "Excuse me?" Marissa said, startled. "The lodge," the man continued, his voice trembling. "It's not safe. It never has been. People disappear here. Always have." Marissa laughed nervously. "That's a little dramatic, don't you think?" But Erin leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Disappear? What do you mean?" The man hesitated, then whispered, "They don't find you. You become part of it, like the others." Before Erin could ask more, the man stood and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. That night, Erin couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the old man's words and the strange photo from 1923. Around 2 a.m., the humming returned. This time, it was louder, resonating through the walls. "Marissa, wake up!" Erin hissed, shaking her friend. Marissa groaned but sat up. "What is it now?" The humming grew louder, joined by soft whispers. Erin pointed to the door, her voice trembling. "It's out there." Marissa rolled her eyes and got out of bed, heading for the door. "You're freaking out over nothing. Watch, there's nothing there." She unlocked the door and swung it open. The hallway was empty. "See?" Marissa said, turning back to Erin. But as she did, the door slammed shut behind her. "Marissa!" Erin screamed, running to the door and yanking it open. The hallway was empty again. Marissa was gone. Erin's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stepped into the corridor. The whispers surrounded her now, echoing off the walls. She turned toward the stairs and froze. At the far end of the hall, a figure stood in the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale and gaunt. She raised a hand, pointing directly at Erin. Erin bolted, running down the stairs and into the grand hall. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic. The front door was locked, the heavy chains rattling as she pulled at them. Behind her, the whispers rose into a deafening chorus. She turned and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows. The guests from the photographs. Their faces were expressionless, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The last thing Erin remembered was their icy hands reaching for her, pulling her into the darkness. When a new group of guests arrived days later, they found the lodge as they always did, warm, inviting, and empty. On the wall, a new photograph had been added. Winter 2025, the lost weekend. Aaron and Marissa stood among the others, their faces blank and staring, forever part of the lodge's shadowy past. Natalie had always been a skeptic. Haunted houses, ghost stories, she brushed them all off as nothing more than fiction. So when her friend Emily invited her to a remote cabin in the woods for the weekend, Natalie saw it as the perfect opportunity to disconnect from the world and enjoy a quiet getaway. The cabin was nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was rustic but charming, with a stone fireplace and large windows that framed the dense woods outside. It was the kind of place that seemed to invite rest, with nothing to disturb the peace, except the occasional sound of birds or wind rustling the trees. At least, that's how it seemed at first. The first night, everything was perfect. Natalie and Emily sat by the fire, chatting and laughing as the night grew darker outside. But as the evening wore on, a strange feeling settled over Natalie. She couldn't quite explain it, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if something was waiting just beyond her sight. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, noticing the way Natalie kept glancing nervously at the windows. "I'm fine," Natalie replied, trying to shake off the unease. "Just tired, I guess." But that wasn't it. There was something unsettling about the cabin, something that made her skin crawl whenever she wasn't paying attention. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows like a living thing, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. They went to bed around midnight, Emily taking the master bedroom. Natalie stayed in the guest room on the opposite side of the house. Around 3 a.m., Natalie woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they echoed through the house in the dead silence of the night. At first, she thought it was Emily. Maybe she had gotten up to use the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't sound like Emily. They were too heavy, too measured, as if someone was walking with purpose. Natalie lay frozen in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, coming closer, then stopping just outside her door. Her heart began to race. She told herself it was just her imagination, the house creaking in the cold. But the longer she listened, the more convinced she became that someone or something was out there. The door creaked, and Natalie's breath caught in her throat. It opened, but no one was there. The hallway outside was dark and empty, the air cold as ice. Natalie waited a few moments, unsure of what to do. Should she call Emily? Should she check to see if everything was okay? Before she could move, the footsteps started again, this time in the hallway outside Emily's room. This was no coincidence. She grabbed her phone and texted Emily. "Are you awake? Someone's walking around the house." There was no reply. Panicking, Natalie slipped out of bed and crept toward Emily's room. The footsteps continued, and this time they sounded closer, closer to her. As she reached for the door handle, a voice echoed through the hallway. "Come out! Come play with us!" It was a whisper, a child's voice, but it was filled with an unnerving, otherworldly calm. The hair on the back of Natalie's neck stood on end. She hesitated, then slowly opened the door to Emily's room. The bed was empty. The room was as cold as the hallway, but there were no signs of Emily. The door to the closet was slightly ajar. Without thinking, Natalie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She wasn't sure why, maybe to hide, maybe to wait for Emily to return. But the moment she stepped into the small, dimly lit space, the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The footsteps stopped. The voice came again, but this time it was right behind her. "Don't be afraid. We're just playing." Natalie spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The closet door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the walls. The room was pitch black. She couldn't see a thing. "Emily!" she cried out, her voice trembling. But the only answer was the sound of breathing, deep, ragged breaths, as though something was standing right next to her, its face inches from hers. She backed against the wall, trembling, her eyes straining to make out anything in the dark. The breathing grew louder. The temperature dropped, her breath visible in the icy air. The voice came in, softer than, almost a whisper. "Stay with us. Stay forever." Suddenly, the closet door flung open and Natalie stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. She spun around, searching for any sign of Emily, but there was nothing. The house was eerily silent. Then a shadow passed by the door. It was Emily. But when Natalie called her name, the figure didn't turn around. Instead, it walked straight past, its footsteps slow and deliberate, its head bent at an unnatural angle. It stopped at the stairs and turned to look at Natalie, revealing an empty, hollow face, its eyes dark and lifeless. The figure raised a hand, its fingers curling into a twisted, grotesque smile. "Come play with us," it whispered again. Natalie turned and ran. She didn't stop to grab her things, didn't check to see if Emily was behind her. She ran out the door and into the freezing night, her heart pounding in her chest. As she ran toward the nearest road, the sound of footsteps followed her, closer and closer, until she could feel the cold breath on her neck. She dared not look back. The next day, when the authorities arrived, they found the cabin exactly as it had been. Everything in place, nothing disturbed. But Emily was gone, and so was Natalie. The cabin stood empty, abandoned once more, waiting for the next uninvited guest. Lena had always loved the serenity of winter. The quiet, the crisp air, and the stillness of freshly fallen snow made her feel at peace. That's why she decided to spend the weekend alone at her family's remote cabin in the mountains, far from the noise and bustle of the city. The first night was everything she hoped for. She made a fire, sipped hot tea, and settled in with a good book. The wind howled outside, but inside it was warm and cozy. By the second evening, the storm had worsened. Snow piled up against the cabin, and the wind howled with a ferocity Lena had never heard before. The radio crackled, warning of an impending blizzard that would last through the night. Despite the weather, Lena felt strangely at ease. The cabin, though isolated, had always been a sanctuary, a place of comfort and refuge. But that night, as she settled into bed, she heard something that shattered the peaceful atmosphere. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. Startled, Lena sat up, her heart racing. Who could be out there in the storm? No one lived for miles, and she hadn't seen a soul since she arrived. She told herself it was probably just the wind, the sound of branches scraping against the house. But the knock came again, louder this time. She climbed out of bed, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and cautiously approached the door. Her breath was visible in the cold air as she peered through the peephole. Nothing. Confused and a little uneasy, Lena opened the door a crack. There was no one standing on the porch, but the snow had been disturbed. A set of footprints, large and deep, led up to her doorstep, and they were fresh, as though someone had just arrived. Her mind raced. The storm was so intense that no one could have been walking around out there without being completely covered in snow. So how had these tracks appeared? Lena stepped outside, shining the flashlight onto the snow. The footprints led away from the porch, deep into the woods, where the trees loomed like dark sentinels. The wind howled, and the snow fell in thick, swirling gusts, obscuring her view. She shivered, an uncomfortable sense of dread creeping over her. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died. Lena cursed under her breath and fumbled for new batteries in her jacket pocket. When the light came back on, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The footprints that had led away from the cabin were now turning back. Someone was coming back. She quickly slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. Her mind raced. Who could be out there? And why hadn't they knocked? She sat by the fire for the rest of the night, her eyes flicking toward the window every few seconds. She heard nothing but the storm outside. The next morning, Lena felt exhausted, drained by the fear that had kept her awake. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, that the storm had played tricks on her mind. But as she prepared to leave, she noticed something new. The footprints were still there, leading to her doorstep. But this time they were different. They were much deeper. And there were more of them, as though someone had walked around the cabin in circles. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped outside, scanning the surrounding woods. Everything was silent, too silent. The snow was still falling heavily, but the air was unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. She turned back toward the cabin when she noticed a shape standing in the distance, just beyond the trees. A man, tall and hunched, stood motionless in the snow. His silhouette was barely visible against the backdrop of the storm, but there was no mistaking his presence. Lena's stomach turned. She ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind her and pressing her back against it. The man didn't move. The hours passed in a blur. Lena's mind raced, spinning through scenarios, none of which made any sense. Who was this person? Why had he come to her cabin? What did he want? Around dusk, she finally worked up the courage to peek out the window. The man was gone, the area where he had stood now empty, but the footprints remained. They were no longer leading away from the cabin. Now, they were everywhere, circling the cabin, surrounding it, like a trap. A knock at the door. Lena's heart stopped. She dared not answer, terrified of what might be on the other side. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, a low, gravelly whisper. "Let me in. I'm cold." Her breath hitched in her chest. She backed away from the door, her back pressing against the wall. The voice came again, more insistent. "Let me in. I'm cold." Lena could feel her pulse thumping in her ears. She grabbed her phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had cut her off from the outside world entirely. The knocking grew frantic, desperate. Lena backed away from the door, but before she could find another way out, the door swung open by itself. Standing in the doorway was a man, but not the one she had seen earlier. This man's face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with hunger, as if he hadn't eaten in days. His clothes were tattered, stained with dirt and snow. He stepped into the cabin without a word. Lena backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The man smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was so cold," he whispered, his breath a cloud of frost in the air. "Now, I'm warm." Lena didn't get a chance to scream. The cold enveloped her, suffocating her, as the man stepped closer and the snow began to fall harder. The next morning, the cabin stood as it always had, silent, untouched, as if no one had ever been there. The storm had passed, but the footprints in the snow remained, leading out into the woods where they disappeared into the wilderness. Lena was never found, and the man, who was once cold, was now warm and waiting for the next person to answer the knock. Jacob had always found comfort in routine, in the predictable patterns of his life. That's why, when he found himself working at a research station in the farthest reaches of the Arctic, it wasn't such a shock. The station was isolated, no people for miles, no distractions, except the endless stretches of ice and snow. It was perfect for someone like Jacob, who liked to think. He had a purpose, studying climate change, recording data, and keeping track of the harsh, unforgiving environment. But as the days passed and the winter months deepened, Jacob began to feel something strange, a creeping sensation that there was more to the frozen landscape than met the eye. At first, it was just an odd feeling when he was out on his daily walks, collecting samples and taking notes. A faint sound in the wind, almost like a whisper, would make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Sometimes he'd hear footsteps behind him when he was alone in the snow, but when he turned around, there was no one there. But the more Jacob brushed off the unease, the more the sensations grew. One night, he was alone in the station, logging his data in the small control room. The wind was howling outside, shaking the walls, but inside, the warmth of the station was a comfort. As he finished his work, he turned to leave the room and froze. The hallway outside his office was dark, but there, standing at the far end, was a shadow. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The station had been empty for hours. He was the only one there. The figure at the end of the hall didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him. "Hello?" Jacob called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. But then, as if responding to his voice, it began to move toward him, slowly, deliberately, as if it were wading through deep snow. The air grew colder, and Jacob could see his breath in the air. Even though the heater had been running all day, he swallowed hard and took a step back. "Who's there?" The figure paused for a moment, and then, just when Jacob thought it might speak, a voice echoed from the hallway. It wasn't the figure speaking, though. The voice came from all around him, as if the walls themselves were whispering, "Stay, stay with us." Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. He bolted for the door, his legs heavy as if they were wading through thick snow, but he didn't make it far. The door slammed shut in front of him with a deafening crash. Panicking, Jacob turned to the windows. Snow and ice covered the glass, blocking out the light. But through the ice, he saw something that made his blood run cold. More figures, standing just outside the station, their faces obscured by the blizzard, their movements jerky and unnatural. And then the whispers came again, louder this time. "Stay, stay, forever." Frantically, Jacob searched the room for a way to escape, but the door was locked, and the windows were sealed shut. It was as if the station itself had trapped him inside. The shadows outside the windows grew closer, pressing against the walls of the station. Jacob's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything to defend himself with. His gaze landed on the radio, the only way to contact anyone outside. With shaking hands, he grabbed the receiver and called out, "This is Jacob. Come in. Can anyone hear me?" Static was the only answer. "Please, someone help me," Jacob cried into the mic. The static grew louder, then suddenly stopped. A voice came through the radio. "Come join us, Jacob." His blood ran cold. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it sounded strangely familiar, almost like his own. The shadows outside the windows moved again, but this time, they weren't just moving. They were reaching toward the station, their hands pressing against the glass. And when they did, the glass cracked, spiderwebbing across the surface. Jacob stumbled back, falling to the floor as he tried to scramble away from the windows. The radio crackled again. "Jacob, we've been waiting." He could hear footsteps now, pacing outside the station, their rhythm synchronized. The door rattled violently as if something was trying to get in. Jacob couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing longer, the temperature dropping even further. His vision began to blur, and he could feel the cold creeping into his bones. And then, for a split second, everything went silent. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing but the pounding of his heart in his ears. He turned toward the door, and for the first time, the figure at the end of the hall spoke. "Welcome home." The door opened by itself, and Jacob stepped forward, his limbs moving of their own accord. He didn't want to move, but he couldn't stop himself. His feet shuffled forward, one step after another, as if some invisible force was pulling him in. When he reached the door, he stepped into the hallway, and the world around him changed. The walls of the station began to distort, stretching and warping until they were no longer familiar. The floor buckled beneath his feet, and the ceiling seemed to cave in, pulling inward like the belly of a beast. And then, the cold. It was unbearable. The frost spread across his skin, numbing him from the inside out. The last thing Jacob remembered before everything went dark was the sound of his own voice, echoing in the distance. "Stay with us." When the rescue team finally arrived weeks later, they found the station exactly as it had been, empty, abandoned, and covered in ice. There was no sign of Jacob, no signs of a struggle. But deep in the snow, just outside the station's door, they found strange, distorted footprints, footprints that led nowhere. It had been a long, grueling winter for Karen. The snowstorms had been relentless, trapping her in her small, isolated cabin deep in the mountains. For the past few weeks, she hadn't seen another soul. The roads were buried under thick layers of snow, and the only sign of life outside the cabin was the occasional deer that wandered by, leaving prints in the fresh snow. Karen didn't mind the solitude at first. She had come to the cabin to escape the chaos of city life and to spend some time reflecting, writing, and regaining her peace. But as the days turned to weeks, she began to feel something she couldn't explain, a sense of being watched, a feeling that she wasn't truly alone. It started with little things: the creaking of the floorboards at night, the flickering of the lights, the sudden gusts of wind that seemed to rattle the windows, even when the forecast said calm weather. Karen tried to dismiss it as the cabin settling or her imagination playing tricks, but the unease kept building. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she thought she saw a shadow outside the window, a tall, thin figure moving quickly through the snow. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then it happened again. The shadow darted past the window, so fast that she barely had time to blink. Her heart raced as she stared out into the darkening wilderness. There was no one out there, no one she could see, but the shadow had been unmistakable. Karen grabbed her phone to check the time and make sure everything was fine. The signal was spotty, but there was enough to check the weather update. The report called for more snow, but there was no mention of anyone being near the area. Then, the lights went out. It was sudden and complete. The entire cabin was plunged into darkness. She cursed under her breath, scrambling for a flashlight. As she fumbled through the drawers, a soft sound made her stop. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A soft, rhythmic tapping. The sound was coming from the other side of the cabin, just beyond the wall where her bedroom was. Her heart skipped a beat. The tapping continued, and it was followed by a low, hollow sound, like the scrape of something against wood. Karen's blood ran cold. She didn't know what to think. No one could have made it to the cabin. The storm had cut off all access days ago. Then, it stopped. She waited, breathless in the dark. The silence was deafening. But in the stillness, the tapping started again, louder this time. It was as if whatever it was on the other side was growing more desperate. Terrified, Karen grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the source of the sound, her every step echoing in the silence. She reached the wall that separated her bedroom from the living area. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the snow inside, nothing out of place. But the scraping sound came again, followed by a whisper. "Let me in." Karen froze. The voice was faint, like the wind whispering through cracks in the wood, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was outside. She turned the flashlight toward the door, scanning the area. Nothing. The air in the cabin grew cold, and the hairs on her neck stood up. She had no choice. She had to know what was happening. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and stepped outside, the bitter, cold air stinging her skin. The snow had fallen heavily, creating a thick layer over the porch. She scanned the area, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, standing just beyond the porch, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, with long, slender limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its presence was palpable, cold, oppressive. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring. Karen's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, to slam the door and lock it behind her. But her legs wouldn't move. She felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Then, the figure tilted its head slightly, and in the silence of the night, it spoke again, its voice cold and hollow. "Let me in." The words sent a shiver through Karen's spine. She backed away slowly, her flashlight flickering in her hand. The figure didn't move, but its gaze never left her. She turned and bolted inside the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. But the moment she did, she heard it again, the tapping. It was coming from inside. Karen backed away from the door, her breath quickening. She had locked every window, every door, but still the tapping came, echoing throughout the cabin. It was as if someone or something was inside with her, moving through the walls, through the floor. The whispering began again. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." The words repeated over and over, growing louder, more insistent. Karen felt the walls closing in on her, the pressure building until it felt like the cabin itself was alive, suffocating her. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and then, from the corner of the room, the voice whispered one last time, chilling her to the bone, "Now you will listen." The lights flickered back on. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's eyes darted around the cabin, but the figure was gone. The cabin was as it had been, empty, silent, but she could still feel its presence, lingering in the air. She locked herself in her bedroom, pulling the blankets tightly around her. The night stretched on, but she didn't dare leave her room. In the morning, the snow had stopped. The sun shone bright against the fresh layers of snow outside. It seemed peaceful, serene even. But when Karen opened the door to check the outside, she found something that made her blood run cold. There, in the snow, were large, distorted footprints. They led up to the cabin and stopped at the door. No one had entered, but there was something else. Something she hadn't noticed before. A handprint, pressed into the snow, right in front of the door. It wasn't human. It was too wide, the fingers too long. The handprint was still warm. Anna had always been drawn to the idea of solitude, far from the noise and chaos of modern life. So, when she was offered a chance to spend the winter at an isolated lakeside cabin in the Norwegian fjords, she jumped at the opportunity. The cabin had been empty for years, its last tenant, an elderly woman, disappearing without a trace just before the first snowfall. Anna wasn't worried about the place's strange history. She loved the isolation and the beauty of the surrounding wilderness, so she packed up and left the city behind. The first few days were magical. The lake shimmered with the reflection of the snow-covered mountains. The silence was so deep, it seemed to press against her ears, comforting her. She spent her days hiking along the frozen shores, and her nights curled up by the fire, reading and writing in her journal. But there was something odd about the cabin. No matter how much she tried to shake the feeling, there was an unease that clung to the air, like a fog. It wasn't the cabin itself. It was the lake. The first night Anna saw it, she thought she was imagining things. She had been staring out of the cabin's large bay window, watching the stillness of the lake under the pale moonlight, when she saw a dark shape beneath the ice. It was large, much too large for a fish. The shape was moving slowly and purposefully, as if something beneath the ice was aware of her presence and was following her every move. At first, she tried to tell herself it was nothing. Perhaps it was just the reflection of the trees on the ice, or the wind shifting the snowdrift. But as the nights grew colder and the snow began to fall heavily, the shape beneath the ice seemed to grow larger, more distinct. Every night, she would sit by the window, staring at the frozen lake, watching as the shape circled the perimeter, its movements deliberate, like a predator hunting in the dark. Anna tried to push the thoughts out of her head, focusing instead on her writing and the surrounding beauty. But it wasn't long before the sounds started. The first noise was a tapping. At first, she thought it was a tree branch tapping against the window, but the sound came from beneath the floorboard. It was soft at first, almost rhythmic, like someone knocking on the walls of the cabin from the inside. As the days passed, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was walking in the walls. Anna checked the cabin for signs of intrusion. She checked the windows, the doors, and the attic, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The doors were all locked, the windows sealed tight, and yet the sounds continued, always in the dark hours of the night. One night, the tapping grew louder than ever before, so intense that it rattled the walls and shook the floor. Anna sat frozen in bed, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened. The sound was no longer coming from the walls. Now, it was coming from the floor beneath her feet. The ice beneath the cabin seemed to be shifting, groaning, as if something beneath was clawing its way up to the surface. Suddenly, there was a loud cracking sound. The cabin shook, and Anna gasped, bolting upright. The noise was deafening, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to freeze, thick with tension. She ran to the window, her breath fogging up the glass, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The shape beneath the ice was no longer circling. It had broken through. The dark form was rising from the depths of the frozen lake, towering above the ice. Anna's breath hitched in her throat as she saw the thing's twisted, grotesque shape, a mass of dark, slick tendrils that reached out, pulsing in the cold air. It was coming for her. Panic flooded Anna's veins. She grabbed her coat, bolting for the door. But just as she reached the threshold, she felt a cold hand grip her wrist. Whipping around, she saw nothing but darkness. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest echo of a whisper. "Stay with me." Anna yanked her arm free, her heart hammering in her chest. She stumbled outside, her feet slipping on the ice as she made her way toward the lake. The wind whipped at her face and the snow stung her eyes, but all she could think about was escaping the thing in the water. She needed to get away from the cabin, away from the lake. But as she ran, she glanced over her shoulder and saw something that stopped her in her tracks. In the reflection of the frozen lake, she saw herself, but it wasn't her. The figure that stared back at her in the ice was a twisted, distorted version of herself, its eyes blackened and empty, its mouth curled in a menacing smile. The reflection reached toward her, pressing its hand against the ice, and she could feel it, like an invisible force pulling her in. Terrified, Anna backed away, her legs shaking with fear. She turned to run, but something behind her shifted, snapping the ice beneath her feet. Before she could react, the surface gave way and she plunged into the freezing water. The cold hit her like a wall of needles. She kicked and flailed, but the ice quickly closed in, trapping her in its grip. She could feel something moving beneath her, something large, circling her legs, pulling her deeper into the water. Her breath came in gasps, her body going numb, and as the water closed over her head, she heard the voice again, "Stay with me." And then the world went dark. The next morning, the cabin stood in silence. The storm had passed and the lake was calm. The ice was unbroken, smooth as glass. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow leading to the lake. But on the surface of the ice, there was a reflection, Anna's reflection, and in the frozen water beneath it, something moved. Slowly, it reached up through the ice, its fingers cold and lifeless, pulling itself free. Lena had never been afraid of storms. Growing up in the countryside, she had seen more than her share of wild weather. The constant rumble of thunder, the flash of lightning, and the steady beating of rain on the roof were just part of life. But when she arrived at the old farmhouse she had inherited from her late aunt, something about the storm that greeted her felt different. The house sat isolated at the edge of the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It had been empty for years, the windows boarded up, the doors locked tight. Lena had always planned to fix it up, to make it her own, but she never expected to be alone in such a desolate place. Her aunt had left it to her with a strange note. "The house is safe, but don't be there when it storms." The words had haunted Lena for weeks, but she brushed them off as nothing more than eccentric ramblings of a woman who had lived too much of her life in seclusion. It wasn't long after she arrived that the first storm rolled in. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, the sky growing darker with every passing minute. The farmhouse creaked and groaned under the pressure, but Lena wasn't concerned. She made her way to the fireplace, lit a fire, and settled into the old armchair with a book, determined to enjoy the peace and quiet. But as the storm intensified, so did the feeling of unease that settled over her. The sound of the rain against the windows grew louder, the wind howling outside like something hungry. She tried to shake it off, focusing on the fire, but her eyes kept flicking toward the window, where the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally in the gusts of wind. Suddenly, there was a knock. Lena froze. She hadn't heard a car or any other signs of life for miles. Who could be knocking at her door in the middle of a storm? Another knock, louder this time, followed by a low, deliberate scraping sound. It came from the door. Slowly, Lena rose from her chair, heart pounding in her chest. She glanced toward the window, but saw only the wall of rain and the darkened shapes of trees whipping in the wind. A third knock. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She took a step toward the door, but the scraping sound came again, this time from the wall next to her. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone or something was on the other side of the house, dragging itself along the walls. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced. There was no one else here. The storm had trapped her alone in the house. She tried to steady herself, telling herself it was just the wind, just her imagination running wild. But the sound continued, growing louder, more frantic, like something trying to break through. She reached the door and grabbed the handle, her fingers trembling. As she slowly opened it, her heart skipped a beat. No one was there, just the howling storm and the endless sheets of rain. But as she looked out into the darkness, something caught her eye. In the corner of the yard, near the edge of the woods, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its form almost lost in the rain and wind. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring toward her. Its features were obscured by the storm, but Lena could feel its eyes on her, burning into her. Panic surged through her. She slammed the door shut and locked it. Her breath came in shallow gasps and her heart raced. There was no mistaking it now. Something was out there, something that was watching her. The scraping sound continued, now coming from multiple points around the house. At the windows, the walls, the door. It was as if the very house itself was a prison closing in around her. She ran through the house, checking every window, every corner, but there was nothing. No one was there. The storm raged on outside, but the house felt suffocating, as if the air itself was heavy, with something dark and ancient. Lena stumbled into the kitchen, her hands shaking as she tried to find something to steady herself. That's when she saw it, the reflection in the old, cracked mirror hanging above the sink. At first, she didn't recognize herself. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. But that wasn't what caught her attention. Standing behind her in the reflection was the figure from outside. It was taller than before, its form stretched unnaturally, its face an empty, pale void. It was standing directly behind her, so close she could feel the cold from its presence. Lena screamed and spun around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, save for the sound of the storm crashing against the house. Suddenly, the house seemed to breathe, and a voice, deep and ragged, whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't have come back." Lena's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, the words echoing in her mind. She tried to scramble to her feet, but her body wouldn't respond. The voice continued, growing louder, as if the very walls were speaking to her. "The storm calls, Lena. It has always called." The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, swirling around her like dark tendrils. She felt something brushing against her skin, something cold and wet, like fingers tracing her arms. She glanced up at the window and saw the figure again, its face now clearer, twisted in agony, its mouth open in a silent scream. It wasn't just standing in the yard anymore. It was right outside the window, staring at her through the glass, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her soul. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure outside her window began to smile, its lips stretching wide, the expression contorting into something horrifically unnatural. And then, the voice spoke again, this time, from inside her head. "It's too late." The wind picked up again, slamming against the house with such force that the windows rattled. The door slammed open with a deafening bang, and the figure, no longer just a shadow, stepped inside. Its long, skeletal hands reached out for Lena, its grin widening as it came closer, its eyes filled with 1,000 years of torment. Lena tried to scream, but her voice was gone. She could only watch as the figure reached out for her, its touch cold as death, its hollow eyes promising eternal silence. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, there was nothing but the heavy silence of the house, empty once more.